Welcome back to the Tommy Brideson Show. Have you ever looked at your favorite lifter online and tried to replicate their training technique and not had any successes with it at all? Now, I think one of the most popular things going around the internet right now is how you organize and stack your body in a way that keeps you centered and allows you to maintain a really good center of mass during lifting, and particularly during squats and deadlifts. Now, I am really big on this. Putting yourself in the right position at the right time to execute lifting is one of the smartest strategies that you can do to allow you to lift more and lift more reps. It's just such an efficient way of doing things. But not all bodies are created equal. Some people will have longer legs. Some people will have longer torsos. Some people will have longer arms. So when you see your favorite lifter online lifting in a certain way, they have really probably optimized their body type and their training techniques so they come together in a way that allows them to be really, really strong. And the chances are when you as a lifter go in to try and emulate or replicate their training, their technique, it might not work out as well as you thought it could have. So when we're having a look at these different lifters online, you've got to look at their body proportions. And, everyone has a unique makeup. And to oversimplify it, some people have really long legs, and you can have either a really long femur, the top portion of your leg, or a really long bottom portion of the leg, or both. And then other people you'll find have relatively normal size legs, like average size sort of lower limb, but they have a longer torso. Okay, so I'm going to relate this to squatting and deadlifting. And depending on your lever length and depending on how your body is made up, your training technique is going to look very different. So if you're trying to organize your body in a way that's maintaining a really strong position and center of mass, you're going to find that it's going to look different between people. Now, let's chat through some of the differences in these training techniques. And I first want to start off by saying, if anyone says to you that a training technique has to be done in a certain way, chances are you probably don't want to listen to them for training technique. Now, the ethos and the context of the training cues or technique is really important here. Because say, for instance, let's use a deadlift. Say, for instance, someone says that you need to deadlift off the ground with a straight shin angle. That might work for someone with really short legs, but is going to have a very different outcome for someone that, for instance, has long legs and a long torso. It's going to change the way that the deadlift looks off the floor. So that strategy might not work for them. So you've got to be mindful that training technique is individual to the person, and you're going to make changes over time. So if we're talking about squatting and deadlifting, and we're looking at maintaining the center of mass, what we're trying to do is essentially just keep you in a stacked and organized way that is going to minimize any movements within movement. I think that's a really important thing to understand, that when we're doing these big compound movements, we're trying to organize ourselves in a way that we're not getting kicked out of position. We're not getting, pushed into a position that we don't want. For instance, in a squat, coming out of a hole and our torso being pushed forward, because that's going to lift our hips up. So what we want to do is put ourselves in the strongest position possible and not allow the weight to pull us out of position, right? And when you do that, that is essentially what organizing and maintaining center of mass is. You're maintaining yourself in a position that can overcome or maintain the same position throughout a movement. Now, let's have a look at the squat. So let's start with the squat and then we'll move into deadlifts. But having a look at the squat itself, if you have a really, really long torso and short legs, you're probably going to struggle to sit back into your hips and really load it like a low bar squat. Now, the reason for that is because your torso is so long, in order to lean over, your center of mass would shift really far onto your toes or even further forward, because by default, if you were pushing your hips back and tipping your torso down, the center of mass would move out forward, which would then throw out your entire balance of the squat. So for someone that does have shorter legs and a longer torso, their strategy probably isn't going to be sitting back into their hips. They would probably want to stay relatively upright, more like a high bar squat, with an even hip and knee break. So that strategy is for someone with short legs and a long torso. But if we have a look at someone that has, say, for instance, a really long lower body, like legs, both the femur and the tib fib, the amount of knee that has to go over toe for that particular lifter is a lot more than someone that has short legs. So if you have a short torso, but you have really long legs, in order to stay upright, you're going to have a lot of knee over toe. So that squat is going to look very different to someone's squat that has a long torso. So this is why we can't compare training technique. The only way you could really compare training technique to, say, your favorite lifter is by standing next to them or having a look at their lever length makeup between their arms and their legs and their torso, and then going, do I look like them? If I do, okay, maybe I have a good chance or a good success of emulating or replicating their training technique. Now, if we move into actual deadlifts itself as well, the most successful deadlifters, or I shouldn't say the most successful, the people that have the strongest deadlifts have a really long reach, really long arms. And to add to that, if they have a long torso as well, it puts them in a really good position that off the ground, they're in a lot more upright starting position, which means they can really use the momentum off the floor, create some momentum, break the floor. And because they're in such an upright position, it's going to be a lot easier for them to get to a point where they can lock the deadlift out. So someone that has a really long reach is going to have a very different looking deadlift than someone that has, say, short arms. Now, let's look at the differences there. So we've got sumo deadlift and conventional, but the ethos of this kind of remains the same across both of them. Now, if you have someone that does have a really long reach, and say, for instance, you just have average sized legs, you're still going to have a bit of knee over bar at the start. But the advantage is that because of the reach, your torso just comes upright. And by default, your hips are a lot lower than what your chest position is at the very start. So it's just a very mechanically advantageous position to break the floor. It just makes sense. But if we had the same starting position, but we had someone just average size legs, average size torso, but had really short arms, because their reach is a lot less, they're going to have to go further down towards the barbell, which means by default, the hips are going to lift up a little bit higher. So their deadlift off the floor is going to look a lot more like a stiff leg deadlift. It might not look that dramatic, but it's going to have a higher hip position to start. So their deadlift position is completely different to someone that has a long arm position. So all I'm trying to point out here, there's nuances between the limb lengths, between upper and lower body and the torso. And we're not going to go through and break it all out now. But what I want you to start thinking about with your training technique is, when you're looking at it is, and if you're thinking like, how can I optimize my training technique? You also need to sort of move away from just cueing and move away from, looking at your favorite lifter online and going, hey, how do I, replicate that? And you need to go into, well, what are my body proportions? What is advantageous for me? And if you don't know, who can you work with to identify that and help you get in a really, really strong position? Because when we're talking about center of mass and we're talking about putting yourself in the most optimal position possible to lift, it is maintaining a center of mass, but it has to be relative to your actual body structure and your overall positioning. So if you're trying to lift a deadlift like someone that has really long reach, it's a failed strategy. It's not going to work for you. It may work short term, but once you get to a certain point or a certain level of strength, it's probably just going to default back to a path of least resistance, which is just not a good deadlift position, for instance. So the conversation of center of mass is, I've seen a lot of stuff happening online about how to organize yourself in a way that controls the center of mass that will allow you to lift more effectively, reduce your chances of injury. But the reality is it's going to look very, very different for every single person. Now, what I'm seeing a lot of online is people hinging very dramatically at the start of a squat. Now, don't get me wrong. I think setting a hinge and setting your pelvis position, setting and forgetting is really important. But overemphasizing the hinge and that lean of the torso angle is going to put you in a position where you're actually biasing a concentric hip flexion movement. Now, what I mean by that, if your torso angle is really far forward, it puts you into a position where you're actually starting to load up the front of your hips in order to control the position. So instead of eccentrically controlling on the way down, like loading your hips and your glutes, don't get me wrong, you're going to be using them. But instead of that being the main driver of control during the movement, you're going to be actually overloading the front of your hips because you have such a strong hip hinge. And what you'll see is if you continue to drive your hips back during a squat, you'll get to a certain point that your pelvis actually won't be able to maintain neutral. So because your torso's forward and your hips are driving back so far, your pelvis will get to a point and you get a huge butt wink. Now, that is a conversation in itself that we're not going to delve into right now. But if you're butt winking halfway down a squat with a load on your back that's pushing you forward and you're completely unbalanced, that is not going to be a position that is going to withstand heavy loads and a lot of volume. It might be a very, superficial strategy to start, but it's only going to get you so far. And I saw online a couple of lifters over, say, the last month put up videos of them hip hinging and saying, hey, like, I haven't squatted for 2 months. I've been doing all this rehab. First block back into training and my back is cooked. And you look at the squat and you look at the hip hinge and you're like, you're driving your hips so far backwards that your torso has no option but to get pushed forward. So the very thing that you're trying to fix, as in your center of mass and maintain balance, you're actually doing the opposite. Because you're pushing so far back and you're pushing so far forward, you're getting thrown out of position. So during the movement, you're not going to be able to maintain that position. And you're going to get to a certain point and your body's just going to default because it is so good at compensating to make a movement happen. So if you're sitting so far back into a squat, if you continue to sit really far back into a squat, you're going to fall backwards. So your body is smart. Subconsciously, it goes, I've got you. I'm going to sort this out. I'm going to push my torso position forward so that it balances it out like a seesaw. So coming back to the center of mass is, yes, in the squat position, in a deadlift position, you want to be centered, but you have to take into consideration that you don't want to overemphasize it because it actually can do the opposite. But you also need to take into consideration your own body type and makeup. And I think once you identify like how you lift and the most efficient way that you lift, then it's really easy to stack on really meaningful cues, build a ton of tension in your system. Like you're just so efficient. You can tighten things up. You can build and create tension in a way that allows you to lift well and maintain your center of mass. And then that's when you get the real benefit. So, when I'm working with people, especially when I'm working with them to start, it's actually about finding optimal, because everyone's optimal is going to be slightly different. Everyone's squat's going to look slightly different. And, don't get me wrong, this changes over time as well. You might make changes as you adapt to different types of stimuluses, but everyone's optimal is going to look slightly different. But if you dial in on that and you really just focus on finding what works for you based on your levers, based on how you can maintain it under reps, under heavy load, your training program is going to be so much more successful. It's going to be an inbuilt prehab program because you're going to be so less exposed to potential injuries because you're just stacked in a way that's efficient. And, that's really what it comes down to, is efficiency at the end of the day. And I think that's the whole discussion around the center of mass. It's maintaining yourself in a way that allows you to lift the most efficient way possible without getting pushed out of position. That is pretty much the definition of maintaining a good center of mass. But you need to do it with respect to your body type and not look online and try and replicate someone else's training technique, because their training technique is going to be very, very different to yours. So when you're looking at your training program and, you're looking at doing, so say, I have a lot of lifters right now that have come out of a comp prep for powerlifting. And I have a lot of these lifters in higher volume training programs. Now, I would only ever put someone in a high volume program if their training technique is really dialed in, because we're doing hundreds, if not thousands of reps over, say, a 3-month period. And if they're not in the right position, all we're going to do is emphasize bad technique. And it's actually really hard to make changes to your technique, meaningful changes to your technique. It takes a lot of effort consciously. It takes a lot of reps. Like it's not something you can just think about and then next week, all of a sudden your training technique has changed. It takes time, it takes reps, and it takes dedication to actually wanting to change it. So if you're trying to make changes to your technique, you're probably better off, or you're trying to find your technique, you're probably better off sitting in the mid ranges of the actual strength sets, like somewhere between sort of 3 and 6 reps. Optimize your positioning first. Find what works, find what allows you to stay centered, and then add volume. Because I was having this conversation with my team earlier on in the week as well, is I was saying that it's actually quite hard to change an intermediate and advanced lifter. So some people get ridiculously strong, and like they shouldn't be. Like based off their training technique, they shouldn't be that strong. And you look at it and you're like, wow, like it's so impressive that you can lift that much. But it's like the training technique, you haven't earned the right to lift that. But obviously the body is adapted in a way that's allowed it to happen. Changing someone's technique that's at that level is actually quite challenging, because you as a lifter are going to try and default to the path of least resistance. Subconsciously in your brain, the path of least resistance is actually what you already know, and it's what you've already, developed strength in. So if you're trying to make meaningful changes to your training technique, at some point, say you're doing a set of 8 or a set of 10, at rep 6, you might default back to your old training technique. So it's actually really hard to shift the dial in the direction that you want. It's not as easy as you would think, and it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of repetition. So you're better off to spend the time not doing, hundreds and thousands of, reps in the bad position or the non-optimal position. Find the position that works best for you. Find the position that's optimal. Ingrain that as much as you possibly can, and then look at branching out and doing bigger durations towards, say, building strength, building hypertrophy, because you really want to optimize the position that you're in first, so it allows you to make long-term progress. It's a platform for you to then build other qualities on top of. And, I think with the whole conversation around center of mass, it is such a valid conversation. It is something that, if you look at Olympic lifter, have a look at these small Olympic lifters throwing these incredibly large weights above their head. And all that is they're just stacking and aligning their body in a way that is just super efficient. And it's so impressive to see. And don't get me wrong, these guys and girls have muscle mass as well to support it. But the only way that they can withstand that actual position is because they're so centered, they're so stacked, and they have their positioning aligned. So it's such an important part of lifting and long-term progress when you're looking at pushing up your strength and really sort of improving on your lifts. How you hold your body position, how you stack your body position, and then that's when you really add the layers on top of it in terms of muscle mass, doing volume to allow you to, really ingrain that technique, and then you make it stronger later on down in that training process. So, sort of recapping back to the start, look for inspiration in your training technique from other lifters, but you've got to understand that your training technique is unique to you, and what works for you won't necessarily work for someone else. So your best investment that you can do with training is figure out how to get in the most optimal position, find someone, work with them, get in the most optimal position that you can, because it's going to set you up for success in terms of training. And that's it for me today. I'll see you guys on the next episode.